Hello there, welcome back to Language Professora. We are doing a grade 7 Jamaican text and we are about to get into chapter 2. Now, I want to put something out there. In going through this text, I realized that the chapters tend to vary in terms of how they are brought out. Some chapters are pretty short, some are kind of long. And what I found happening was, the chapters, some of them, cycle through several what we call story arcs, meaning you have several rounds of conflict climax resolution taking place. What I have decided to do is, based on how the chapter is laid out, I will approach it accordingly. So for example, in chapter 1, I could just do one set of conflict climax resolution, although you had several. But for chapter 2, there are several mini stories within the whole chapter. What I'll be doing is going story by story, or rather event by event, and outlining the elements as I go through each event. What I'm going to be doing as well, because this one is a little bit long, I'm going to be putting some timestamps in the video. So if you want to identify a particular area of the chapter, check the timestamp, go straight to that section. And I also want to let you students know that these videos are not a replacement for reading the book. Do you hear what I'm saying? So there may be some very key pieces of information that I tend to gloss over because you need to know the details for yourself just the same. So without any further ado, let us get into chapter 2, Frank at School. In the first section, I will name it plot part 1, Frank avoids a flogging. So that's our first event. If you remember, at the end of chapter 1, his friends had come to collect him for school and he was running late. And they reminded him that if you're late, Teacher Days is going to flog you. So this is what is happening now. He arrives at school late and he's waiting in line. What is he doing while he's waiting in line? He's looking around and he's observing a pattern in terms of how Teacher Days is administering the punishment. He recalls 2 incidents. I'm not going to tell you what they are. Go read it for yourself. 2 incidents of students who had tried to avoid being flogged and they were flogged nevertheless. You go read it and figure out what it is. So now the conflict for him is that he's trying to figure out how to escape the flogging. The time is up. So we're now at the climax part of it where he is next in line to be flogged. He makes up a story about falling from a tree, but Teacher Days realizes that his bruises are from a beating and decides to give him a chance instead. Quick resolution to the problem of not being flogged. The other elements. Again, because you're sort of accustomed to this now, I'm not going to be going into the details with the characters. You will do the reading to identify the particulars regarding the characters. But the main characters in this part are Frank, Teacher Days, and the other children who were in the line. The setting is also in terms of place at the school gate, in terms of time in the morning. Now notice time can be anything, right? Can be time of day, can be time of month, time of year, anything. In this case, it is in the morning. And the theme coming out is compassion. Think about which character that I mentioned brings out compassion, discipline, and deception. Again, anytime you think about your theme, you want to think about which character is bringing these themes out and how they're bringing them out. Part 2, Frank ties the girls. So after leaving the gate, he goes to class and he does make an effort to keep out of trouble. But Frank being Frank, he becomes distracted. Enter or conflict. He makes a decision. Remember, conflicts are decisions that are made that impact the rest of the story. He makes a decision to play a prank. And the prank is he's going to tie the girl's dress straps together. He does that and sits back and waits. Now, the reader is going to be held in suspense because the reader is now waiting to see what is going to happen. Anytime you find yourself waiting to see what is going to happen, you have entered the suspense zone. So the suspense builds as we know that the girls have to move at some point, right? Eventually, and I won't go into details with what happens in terms of leading up to the girls having to move, go read it. Miss Tingling, that's the teacher, asks one of the girls a question and she tries to stand. Of course, in trying to stand, because they're all tied together, they all fall down and the entire school is disrupted as a result. So that's the climax part of the story going right there in terms of the conflict of the prank. And the climax is when the prank plays out. Quick resolution, the boys are sent to the office. The other elements of this little event, we have Frank, we have the other boys, and we have Miss Tingling and the girls. Setting is in the classroom and it's about mid-morning. And the theme is, of course, childhood behavior. You know, children are being children. They're being mischievous. Notice I didn't just say mischief, because your theme tends to be like an overarching concept, and underneath it you might have several sub-themes. So mischief could be the sub-theme, but the overall theme would be childhood behavior, or you could say childhood and adolescence. That's a very common theme in adolescent literature. Part 3, Teacher Days flogs the boys. So the boys are now in the office. Enter the conflict, and this is now conflict with others, because Frank is pleading with the boys not to tell Teacher Days that he is the one who tied the girls together. Chiselhead, that is one of the boys, grumbles that he's not going to be taking any punishment for anyone. Here we have suspense entering. Will he tell? Will he not tell? Once you begin to ask those questions regarding an outcome, you have entered the suspense zone. Teacher Days comes in and he's doing some antics with the strap. That is more suspense, because you're anticipating the beating of the boys, remembering that Chiselhead said he's not going to take any beating. What is going to happen next? Suspense. The boys are questioned, and right away Chiselhead says that it was Frank, so that's the climax of that situation. Of course, Frank says it's not true, but the teacher does not believe him, and he flogs the other boys and send them back to class. That's the resolution of that situation right there. The characters, Frank, Teacher Days, Chiselhead, and the other boys. Now, I want to put a plug here. Remember, it's not important just to know who the characters are, but it's important to understand the impact that the character is having on the story itself. So what was Chiselhead's role in this particular story? You understand what I'm saying? You also want to remember that as we go through the characters, notice I'm not doing it this time. I did it in chapter 1 where you were being spoon-fed. Now you're getting a little bit of hard food. You need to know or have an idea in terms of what the character is like. What do they look like physically? What are they like in terms of their personality? And if you go back to the notes, I will maybe plug it at the end of this video. Go back to the notes regarding how do you identify your characters in the literature overview. It will tell you how you do just that. The setting is a school's office and it's about mid-morning now. If you're following the timeline, it should be about mid-morning by now. The theme, honesty versus dishonesty and consequences for actions. Part 4, Mrs. Grant comes to school. So Teacher Days decides to send Frank home for 3 weeks. He sends for his mother. Why did he not send Frank with the note for his mother? Go read it and find out and put it in the comments, the answer to that question. Instead, he sends Frank to collect his books and to go home. Mrs. Grant gets to school and she is quickly apprised of the situation. A little bit more is discussed in between her getting there and her leaving. So, identify what some of those things are. But essentially, they are discussing the merits or demerits of flogging children. Mrs. Grant eventually goes home. Frank cannot be found. Enter a conflict, a problem that needs to be solved. Where is Frank? It's way down in the evening, and at about 8 p.m., Deacon Collins arrives with Frank. That's your climax. Mrs. Grant decides to give Frank a chance. That's your resolution. Mrs. Grant did something when Deacon Collins came to the house. What was it? Drop it in the comments. The other elements of part 4. So, of course, we have Frank, Mrs. Grant, Teacher Days, and Deacon Collins. Tell me about what those characters are like. The setting moves from the school office to the Grant home, and the time is from in the morning, afternoon, into the night. Theme: physical abuse of children in school, or what we call corporal punishment. And of course, childhood and adolescence. Part 5, Inspection Day. Now, going back to part 4, Mrs. Grant actually struck a deal with Teacher Days regarding Frank's suspension. What was the deal that she struck with him? Frank is back at school. It's the day before inspection, and he realizes that a lot has changed. What is it that has changed? And that what is it that has changed is a question for you to answer by reading the actual text, right? Remember, I'm just here giving you an idea, giving you a little bit of a gloss over, giving you some interest to actually go read the story for yourself. So it's inspection day now, and the children are all dressed very formally. There are a few stories told in there in terms of how they look, what they're wearing, how comfortable or uncomfortable they are. Go and read that and see what's going on there. There is a conflict taking place because everyone is nervous. Everyone needs to impress these school inspectors. And so that's a part of the conflict that is taking place right there. Devotion ends and they're waiting anxiously. That is the suspense building. The inspectors finally arrive and begin the examination. Another conflict pops up as Frank is selected to read, but he knows he's not a good reader. What is he going to do? Frank decides that he's going to pick a story that he knows well, and he tells the story pretending to read. So that's the climax of that little situation there. And resolution, he is commended for being one of the best performers for the day, and that is a shock to the entire school and left them speechless and talking about it. The other elements of part 5, we have Frank, the teachers, the other children, Mr. Radway and Mr. Ball, who were the school inspectors. The setting is school and it's during the daytime. The theme here, dishonesty/trickery. Which character brings that out? We know by now who that is. Education. So if you think about the way in which the examination is being done, education comes out as a theme, and poverty comes out as a theme as well. I want you to go and identify where in the chapter do you see poverty coming out as a potential theme. And I need to point something out about the setting as well. If you notice, some of the things that you see unfolding are actually reminiscent or indicators of the era in which the story is set. If you go back to our literature overview and what we spoke about for setting, and that era can also be a setting. So when we talk about era, we're talking about the time in history, so to speak. So currently we are in 2024, but are we in this story, are we in 1824, 1924? Are we in 1950? Are we in 1980? What era are we in? And a lot of the things that we see happening with regards to how the school is set up and how the examination is set up. What is it like now in terms of your school examination compared to then? And that era back then kind of tells you what education was like back then. Part 6, Frank stones Miss Tingling. We have some time passing between the inspection and this particular event. And at this point in time now, we notice that Frank has some changes taking place in his life. His attendance pattern is off, and his attire, his hygiene, everything about him has changed, and it is noticed. His mother has moved to Kingston, and as a result, he's now on his own with his father. On this particular day in question, he's at school. After several weeks missing in action, he's finally at school, and he comes to school with a lot of mischief, conflict. Miss Tingling leaves the room briefly, and Frank does something cheeky. I won't say what it is, but tell me what it is that he did, and why do you think he did it? When Miss Tingling returns, she realizes what he has done, and then she goes for the strap to flog him. Suspense begins to build. Is she going to flog him or not? Frank threatens to stone her if she hits him. More suspense. She sends for the stones and dares him. The suspense is now building up to the climax where will he hit her with the stones or not? Something has to happen. Frank being Frank, what does he do? He of course hits her and runs away. And that's the climax of that particular event. But it's not quite over yet, because in running away, he is being chased by several students, and only one manages to catch him. That is your resolution. Who are the players in this part? We have Frank, Miss Tingling, the other children, Cockdog Flea, which is the boy that caught Frank, and Mr. Thompson. Who is Mr. Thompson? Go read it and tell me who is Mr. Thompson in the comments. The setting is the school and the sorry lo siento. The setting is a school and the general countryside in the community. Do you notice that between chapter 1 and chapter 2 we have not yet been told the name of this community? Don't worry about it. That's coming up in some other chapters, okay? But notice that we have not really officially been told yet. The theme coming out, we have neglect, of course. Look at what's happening with Frank. And we have disrespect for elders and authority. Part 7, Frank and Cockdog Flea. So picking up where part 6 left off. Frank and Cockdog Flea are arguing as Frank refuses to go back to school with him. Conflict. The boys get into a physical fight, and Frank eventually gets the better of Cockdog Flea. I think he held him down in some maca bush, and that was where Cockdog Flea basically gave up and said, okay, Frank, you win. That's the climax of that little situation there. Then the resolution is Cockdog Flea running off, threatening Frank from afar, but Frank knowing that there's no going back to school after this. How do you hit a teacher with stones? I think one hit her in the forehead, the other one hit her on the ankle. How do you hit a teacher with stones and expect to go back to school? So the resolution is, it's the end of school for him. The other elements, the two main characters, Frank and Cockdog Flea. The setting is in the countryside. Theme, childhood and adolescence. Because boys fight, right? That's just a part of childhood. And our final part for this chapter is Frank is now out of school. So what we see happening is a synopsis of what Frank is getting up to now that he's out of school. And he spends all his time in the community creating mischief. He hides in the bushes and he teases people. Now, in this particular section, on this particular day, he chooses his target. He decides to tease a particular man. conflict, he makes a decision that leads to further problems. So he lays in wait for the gentleman, suspense building. The man appears and Frank calls out and frightens him. The climax, and the man runs away. Resolution. We also see him having a run-in with King Myrodus. What are the details of that run-in with King Myrodus? You know where to put your answer, right? In the comments below. The other parts of part 8. We have Frank, we have Mass Ben, that's the gentleman that Frank frightened. What was the nickname that Frank called out for Mass Ben? Tell me in the comments below. And we have King Myrodus. For our setting, it's the countryside in terms of location, place, and in terms of time, several weeks have passed. And we're moving from daytime to nighttime in this particular snippet. Theme, we have neglect again, because we see where Frank is under no parental control really, and we have disrespect for elders. An overall summary of chapter 2 is a very long chapter, right? But what we see coming out is there are several events that unfold, and we are basically cycled through Frank's school life in a sense. What we also see are quite a few instances where the themes of especially neglect and disrespect for elders is being brought out. So pay close attention to that. Now, rather than a quick recap, I actually have some questions that I'd like you to answer. 1. How do we see Frank change between the start and the end of the chapter? Think about it. 2. How could Frank have avoided dropping out of school? What do you think he could have done? 3. In what ways is the theme of disrespect for authority and elders brought out? Remember, when we talk about theme, we talk about the characters and how the characters bring out these themes. 4. And I mentioned this earlier. What are some aspects of the chapter that tells you in what era the chapter is set? So not just reading the story itself, maybe you're going to have to do a little bit of research in terms of what was the education system like in Jamaica in a particular era, and see if what you're seeing in the story matches with the era that you have found out about through your research, right? As usual, happy reading!